Evening. This is Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Dave Frank. We are talking the national news of the day. We are actually going to put the war on second tier tonight because, we've had very heated hearings over the potential Supreme Court Justice Jackson. She is on her, I believe, still going on her third day of testimony in the senator's Judicial Committee hearing, and the third day has gotten to be the most heated. The first day was almost kind of tame, but Senators Hawley and Graham and Cruz are relentless. Senator Hawley just will not let up on the child molester cases that she ruled on, in which case they are complaining about the sentences being too lenient. He's emphasizing one particular case. She refuses to comment on a particular case. She just simply, which, she argues would be unfair to the victims and everybody in that. She just emphasizes that she took into consideration what the prosecution asked for and their presentation, as well as the defense presentation, as well as the probation's presentation and their recommendation. And apparently the Republicans have completely ignored probation's recommendations in these cases. At any rate, Hawley is really hammering on that. Cruz is hammering on that. He actually kind of took Hawley's thunder on a bunch of this stuff because being senior, he got to go first. Cruz has been interrupting. Durbin has been interrupting Cruz. They've been going at each other. Senator Leahy just lashed into Graham. Graham has been all over the place, complaining and talking about, well, you were mean to Kavanaugh, and so I'm going to be mean to her. And it's just, and he stormed out mad about something. Nobody even really completely understands what he's mad about. It's not impressing anybody. Senator Tester, who is kind of one of the more moderate Democrats, said it's BS, except that he, said it outright. I'm not moved by anything the Republicans are doing. They're trying to turn it into a circus. She has, for the most part, kept her cool. She's not off script. She's just basically, answering the questions. She, did what she believes to have been justice in each of those cases. She's also being attacked for basically representing her clients as a defense attorney. She will be the first Supreme Court justice to have been a public defender. That seems to offend some people, or at least they pretend like it offends them, because that is what they're playing up. They really tried to play the culture war, trying to bring up critical race theory because, the school she went to and the school that she's a board member on, she keeps trying to say it's a private school for one thing. And critical race theory is their buzzword, buzz term for the year. But she isn't biting. She does look like she's tired, but she is not getting drawn into the argument. She's letting the Democratic senators defend her. And that's pretty much, I think, about the summary. Dave.
Yeah, thank you for framing it the way you did. I think you touched on a lot of the key points that we've seen over the last several days. I think big picture, because it's a 50-50 Senate, the Democrats appear to be sticking together. And then the Vice President, Kamala Harris, would be the deciding vote, that they're fairly confident that as long as there's no gaffes, that she will, in fact, be approved on a straight party line vote. I know you mentioned you might see some Republicans acting in a gesture of bipartisanship, to be determined. But I think so big picture, there's, the prevailing wisdom is that despite the Republicans grandstanding and bluster and talking points for political points, political reasons, and just flat out looking for disruptive commentary on her nomination, that she's so far been doing a really good job. So I think she's been measured, she's been patient, and she's been articulate. I'm not promoting in any way, but I'm just, my observations of how she's responded to the repeated attacks over the last several days. And so the Kavanaugh comparison, I think, is something that's important that you pointed out, that I've heard from Republicans saying, look, what the Democrats did to Kavanaugh was so terrible and so beyond the pale that we're obligated to do the same in this circumstance. I don't know how true that is. That's really, that they have some duty to be highly negative and disruptive, but that's, feeding the base basically. And one last original, observation here. One last, preliminary observation is that I did see Judge Jackson's point out to, I think it was Senator Blackburn, that there's a difference between policy and a legal decision. So she explained pretty clearly, at least a few times, that when it comes to legal decision, she expressed very conservative views. The originalist text argument that she's looking for the intention of the people who wrote the particular laws in question, and that's the job of the judge to weigh all facts and apply to the intention of the law. That's a relatively conservative position, but that in her life, she, as a human being, she's made speeches, etc., written papers, etc., where she talks about policy or references policies, and that's an outside of the courtroom role. For example, sentencing guidelines, like you talked about the child pornography case sentencing. I think that was the example she used. She also used that with abortion, and I think I also heard her use it with critical race theory, actually. So where she was basically saying, like, legislatures and other entities deal with policy, but my role as a judge is to apply the law. And then she tried to make clear that she would not inject her own personal opinions in legal decisions. So I think she's handled that tightrope. She's been walking the tightrope pretty well.
Yeah, I don't remember which Democrat did it, because some of the Republicans kept trying to draw the comparison. Well, we're treating you better than Kavanaugh was treated, and I think finally one of the Democrats asked, "Well, have you been accused of sexual assault?"
Right.
Judge Jackson. I mean, so it's really gotten kind of nasty in there, and at any rate, it is what it is, and it is pretty bad. It used to be that these things, every once in a while something would come up and it would be kind of a partisan vote. But generally speaking, when a president nominated somebody for the Supreme Court, it was usually 80 to 90 votes, sometimes even over that, because it was generally the assumption was that a president could nominate who they want for it, and the question was whether or not they were qualified, not whether or not they had the right decisions. Roe v. Wade was, kind of started to change that. That was a politicized decision. There were political decisions before that, but that really started to change. That became one of the first litmus tests. Do you support it or do you oppose it? And then after that, and it may have even started with Brown v. Board. But at any rate, it is very intense, and the measure of bipartisanship is whether or not you get one or two or three or four Republicans or somebody from across the aisle voting for you. That's considered bipartisan these days, and.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt you, but I thought you were pausing there for a sec. You mentioned litmus test. I think that's an important thing to mention for folks that don't really follow this as closely as we do. That phrase, like you said, it comes from abortion. The abortion, I believe that's the policy issue. Like you said, that's my recollection, that there was a litmus test. If people could, read the tea leaves and try to figure out under the surface if people were truly pro-life or if they were pro-choice, or however they fell on that spectrum, because I think most Americans they want abortions to be safe and rare, basically. So that's not one or the other, right? So it's a really complicated issue that gets boiled down to like a pregnancy test, like either you're with us or you're against us. So the legacy, I think, of that litmus test now is that as some conservatives have pointed out, that with Justice Kavanaugh's hearings, people were going through his yearbook comments and saying, like, when you said this in your yearbook when you were 17 years old, did it mean that you felt this way? And so that I think that's a very contentious.
It is, but he was being accused of a serious crime when he was 17. So that was an issue, and she was pretty credible. Very credible, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
one last thing about this. Justice Souter was seen as the stealth candidate, right? I mean, he was nominated by the Sununu Senior, and everybody loved him, right? Or the Republicans all loved him, and they thought they were getting in, this great conservative guy because he had all these conservative rulings. Then all of a sudden, and people, progressives were out against him. Then he gets in there, he's this big progressive. Later on, he's asked about it. Well, why did you switch so drastically from conservative to liberal rulings? He said, because laws passed in New Hampshire were conservative. It's a conservative place up there. I was following the law. Anyway, more on that. We'll still be discussing that next week, but we are moving on.
So you're not going to answer my question?
No, I've answered your question, and my answer
You
is
haven't
I've
answered my question.
explained.
I'm sitting here asking you, and you're declining to answer.
Good. Good.
I understand.
Absolutely
Senator, but
good.
what
I hope you
we're
are.
trying to do.
Good.
Allow her to finish, please. There's no point in responding. He's going to interrupt you.
I love this country because I love the law.
The chairman refused to allow a witness to answer a question. You can bang it as loud as you want.
He was ambushed. How would you feel if we did that to you?
No, Senator, I didn't say
That's
versus.
exactly what you said.
To see the badgering of this woman as she's trying to testify, I thought was outrageous.
I'm sitting here asking you, and you're declining to answer.
I've explained how the guidelines work. Judges all over the country are grappling with how to apply this guideline. Do you have other questions for me?
Yeah, I do. I do.
I think we should recognize that jackassery we often see around here is partly because of people mugging for short-term camera opportunities.
Okay, President Biden is, being praised for his leadership of having pulled a coalition together and put together sanctions that is so far held after several weeks of this invasion, a coalition that is actually these countries that have for a long time not dedicated resources to their own defense. You can debate whether or not that was a good thing, but these countries are doing it. He is now going to Europe and is going to be in Poland on Friday. A very big symbolic move, and he's basically taking Putin on head to head. Is the way they're looking at it. Is Putin now is threatening cyber warfare, threatening to throw that you can only buy his products with rubles. I mean, he's threatening to basically undo the economic system. We are talking economic warfare here, and Biden is kind of stepping in, trying to be a symbolic leader where he's kind of been in a collaborative position up until now. We're not exactly sure as to what role he's going to play, but this is seen as a step up, and some new sanctions have been introduced. We're going to talk about whether or not the sanctions and the assistance to Ukraine have been effective in the next segment. But what is going on here, Dave? What is Biden doing, and what are the stakes?
So I would say that the alliance, the NATO alliance, the European Atlantic alliance with the United States, but also in the Venn diagram of life, there's also a security arrangement between Australia and UK and the United States that I think it's called AUKUS. So there's a military aspect of this, which is basically the new Cold War. I remember hearing that a couple of years back, maybe 3, 4, actually probably 14. So 8 years ago, we already were on this path. But I think now the president is stepping in to say, hey, we may have had faults in the alliance. We may have had weaknesses in our ability to prepare, but now is the time. So if you look at Mr. Sullivan, the spokesperson for the Secretary of State, has said the president is traveling to Europe to ensure we stay united, to cement our collective resolve, to send a powerful message. We're prepared and committed for as long as it takes. And then he went on to say, allies are more united, more determined, and more purposeful than at any point in memory. So there's that piece of it, which is just, like you said, sort of symbolic leadership. But also he's meeting with G7 to talk about economic sanctions, that the group of 7 most powerful economic countries. to try to solidify the sanctions that have had some gaps and weaknesses, and talk about new approaches. I think the UK was ahead of us in several of the elements, like, for example, sanctioning a broader set of oligarchs, and a few other things, sanctioning all of the parliament as opposed to us, which United States just sanctioned a few. So I think now he's going to go travel there and say the United States is ready to go into alignment with what the UK has already proposed in many cases. But thirdly, the third element of this, besides strategic and economic, is the fact that there's a humanitarian refugee crisis.
Yes.
And so major investments in those countries. And that's why I think Poland is key, because it is the eastern edge of the alliance. It borders Belarus and Ukraine. Not that there's going to be any kind of iron curtain, but the idea is that at some point there's going to be near misses and potential problems where Putin might benefit as he gets more and more cornered or weak or slips. He might errant missile across a border, that's World War III right there, sort of beyond our control. He can sucker us in, so to speak. So I think the resolve and the unity is kind of needs to be buttressed as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and that's why it's there.
There's already been a Russian drone that wandered across. They're pretty sure it was an accident, but it did crash across. Nobody was hurt or anything. But this can happen, especially now that Putin's gone to Plan B. And we'll talk a bit about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine in the next segment. But they're not faring very well against the Ukraine military right now. So they are apparently deliberately wanting to kill civilians. I mean, it just really seems that way, and wanting to spread the war into areas that had been peaceful in the West, and that means sending missiles into Western Lviv and some of those towns. And yeah, some of them are very close to the border. People in Poland say they can hear the explosions sometimes. So it is very, very close. And I think we're at like 3 million refugees that have left the country now. The Czech Republic is saying they're pretty much at capacity. Other countries are saying they're pretty well stressed. They need at least more resources if they're going to take more on. And it is a crisis. There is a lot of money being thrown in. I wish there was as much concern for refugees coming from Syria and other places like that. But maybe this will set up infrastructure for it. And if the countries can put aside the racism, maybe it'll happen in the future. But at least it's there. He is going to at least put on the leadership role here domestically. There hasn't been a whole lot of criticism yet. There's been some. Interesting enough, I think the 12 Republican senators who voted against the 13 million, or forget how much, the aid to Ukraine are saying he's not doing enough. I mean, it's kind of funny. They voted against every single aid package. You've got some of the crazies, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who says, I don't even know why we're supporting Ukraine, that are outright almost supporting Putin out there. And you have people going back and forth that are in the media. I mean, it's really kind of crazy. And you've even got a couple of House members that are right into the QAnon world in terms of this. So it's and I go online and there are all kinds of conservatives who actually support Putin. I mean, outright. I mean, that are on this. So it's going to be really interesting political gamesmanship here. So Biden going to the summit is a big deal, and we'll see how it affects American politics.
Yeah, that's the thing. I would say, I'll work backwards. So you talked about, for example, there are some elements within the GOP in the United States who seem not to have gotten the memo about the unified front facing Russia. It turns out that, not to disparage any single entity or any single funding source for public political speech, but the Koch industries does have solid and enduring and long ties to Russia, and they fund tens of millions of dollars of campaign speech. So a lot of the people are sort of like Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of the others, and I don't know her in particular, but a lot of folks are just speaking their party line, so to speak. But more importantly, I think than that sort of domestic. Are some people not on the same page? Is the question of, is NATO and the United States, or is Europe and the United States on the same page when it comes to those jet fighters, for example, we talked about last week,
right.
Trying to de-escalate to the greatest extent possible, or at least prevent escalation, not committing U.S. troops, not committing, and I think the word provocative was former Assistant Secretary of State said don't use that word because Putin is the provocateur. But in the English language, basically de-escalation or lack of escalation is their preferred nomenclature here. But the idea is that Poland, for example, said, hey, we have these jets and these guys already know how to fly them and they need them. And if NATO's not going to send troops, and if we're all not going to send troops, then just give them the highest end weapons that we can. So I think that if things get even worse from a humanitarian catastrophe, there's already millions of people displaced internally, not just those that are leaving the border. So if more and more civilian casualties are pointed out by the International Criminal Court investigator, if Russia continues down this path of denial about the actual acts on the ground of hostility that they're taking, then we might see some other conversations about different weapons. But as of right now, I think Biden's trying to get everybody settled in on the same page and not escalating.
All right. Well, Dave, that was a perfect segue into this segment because we're going to discuss both the sanctions and the aid to the Ukraine, and is it working? To the Ukraine. I keep saying the Ukraine. It's Ukraine, and is it working? Well, there is a report out that I'm not even trying to pronounce the name of the company, but Russia's biggest tank making company has stopped, at least temporarily, because they cannot get all of the component parts. There is the economy is still in big trouble. They are trying to adjust with it, and they tried to make moves into cryptocurrency. That didn't work. They've been trying to do a lot of other things, but there is a big question as to whether or not they can sustain a long war, and that's why they're kind of getting desperate in bombing civilians, as we discussed in the last segment. But they of all people should know that doesn't subdue a population. Their own history should teach them that. Putin should know better, right? It just galvanizes a country, a people. And so getting back into Ukraine, the Ukraine military has held. And not only that, they actually seem to be retaking territory, of all things. I mean, this was what everybody thought at the beginning was going to be a quick Russian takeover and then a guerrilla war fought in and out of the cities. I mean, that's why the Ukraine government gave out these 18,000 machine guns. They regret it now because they're dealing with friendly fire and looting and stuff like that. They thought it was going to be the Russians' problem, but the only city that Russians took, the only major city, was Kherson. It looked like they were going to take Mariupol, but they keep announcing, everybody keeps saying, oh, it's about to fall, and it's still holding on, due large in part to the fact that apparently Nazi soldiers are good at killing Russians, but that's another subject entirely. But there's been a counterfront out of I'm going to probably butcher the pronunciation, Mykolaiv, which is a town that the Russians need to be able to get a land assault against Odessa because of the river, because the Ukraine military took out the bridges to get there. And without a land front, they can't do an amphibious assault. That would be suicide. So Odessa is safe from everything except aerial bombing right now. And not only did that fail, but now the front has reversed and Ukraine is now pushing back towards Kherson, and they may retake the city, according to some people. Meanwhile, up in Kyiv, they have pushed back towards the west, pushed the Russians back out of the suburbs of Kyiv, and just before we came on to record the show, it looked like they pushed back to the northeast. They are actually not just a guerrilla force, but they are actually a force pushing Russians back. I mean, they're outnumbered 5-1, or were. Apparently 40,000 troops have either been of Russian troops have been either killed, wounded, or captured. That means removed from the field. That's a lot of the original. I don't even know how many there were, and they're discouraged. They're not able to supply their lines. So I would say that the assistance, 150, well, okay, if 150,000, I'm being told, if 40,000 of them are out of commission, maybe they've been able to bring some more in, more conscripts. That's still a lot, and that's still got to be demoralizing. Anyway, it does look like the assistance, the javelins, the stingers, the NLAWs, the all of the RPGs, the intelligence assistance, on top of whatever it is that's happening, has been effective. And Russia may not just be stalemated; they could be losing ground and possibly losing an edge. It's both encouraging and worrisome, because right now Plan B is killing civilians. Plan C could be a little scarier. Dave.
Yeah, so there's multiple levels here. Obviously, we originally introduced this topic as sanctions and aid. Is that working? So with respect to, I'll start with that. With respect to sanctions, this is a very long-term strategy to isolate them both by preventing like luxury goods, travel, freezing assets, being stripped of most favored nation status. So there's talks to tighten the noose on those things. For example, like I said earlier, increasing the number of oligarchs that are sanctioned. Also, instead of just former officers, former government officials, like the entirety of the parliament, lower house of parliament, that's like a next step. And then also oil and natural gas. So like the U.S. has said, hey, we're not going to buy any Russian oil anymore. UK said by the end of the year. EU said, well before 2030. So that's 8 years from now, right? Like so there's not a short-term goal of the sanctions. Also, freezing their financial foreign assets, about half of their $630 billion in foreign assets, which is like the fourth largest of all in the world, that's been frozen. That severely limits them, but not entirely. Even though they're not part of the Bank of International Settlements right now, they're being frozen out of that, which is pretty critical to maintaining any kind of trade and commerce, but they are exporting lots of oil because Europe needs it. Mm-hmm. So 40% of all natural gas in Europe comes from Russia and 25% of all oil. So no matter how much they cut to the bone, that's going to take years to change. So in other words, Russia is still getting lots of hard currency denominated in U.S. dollars and euros, which means that these sanctions have huge holes in them. And so there's nothing quick about the current financial arrangement. So that's one piece. But militarily, that's a different story. And like you said, it has sort of fought to a stalemate. And, there are dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of experts out there with solid opinions on this. But just as a sort of summary of the things that I've seen, and then, feeding off of some of the things that you've said, they're making do. Ukraine is making do with 20% of the force. For example, with their jet fighters. What they're doing is the jet fighters, whenever they scramble them when they see Russian jets, and then they get engaged in dogfights like we haven't seen since World War II. Yeah. And then they lure them into where there's ground missiles, and then they shoot them down. So Russia can't pursue anymore. They can't engage in dogfights anymore. So there's a crippling effect there. Now, if Russia chose to, they could escalate immensely. I mean, they are a superpower, right? So the question is, if the first 4 to 5 day military takeover that they intended to have, where they just march into Kiev and sort of everybody around Putin just yesed him and his scheme for this has apparently failed on the first pass. But like you said, what are they doing now? And what they're doing now is sort of this, apparently, as of today, sort of the desperation of attacking civilian centers. One thing I would think is really important to point out is that there is a sort of a tale of two cities. So in addition to financial sanctions, in addition to military engagement, there's also the information war. And people are saying that Ukraine's doing an amazing job of keeping truth in the public sphere so that the globe can bear witness to atrocities and effectively war crimes. Even President Biden himself said, yes, he's a war criminal because these are the things they're doing are
they
bad.
made it official today. Yeah.
There you go. So last night I heard Dmitry Peskov, who's a spokesperson for the Kremlin, and he stuck to the Putin party line like you would not believe on Christiana Mompour's news show. And he basically kept giving the same talking points from the original invasion of what Putin wants out of this. And it hasn't changed at all. So to a certain extent, they're locked in a strategy that has very limited chance of success. So not just a military stalemate, but a diplomatic stalemate, because Ukraine is willing to negotiate. Ukraine is willing to apparently, according to all the things that they've been saying, they're willing to try to end the war and find peace. But finding peace and allowing things to stay in their equilibrium status quo is not what the Kremlin is currently signaling. So for lots of reasons, this stalemate could be a pause before things get worse as Russia digs in more.
Yeah, real quickly, the other thing that's happening is a bunch of advisors are disappearing. Putin's, a couple of the generals and stuff. It's not a good sign. I mean, something's happening, and probably, well, anyway, more on that next week. We'll talk about that. That takes us to the next segment.
The Court of Appeals here in Washington has ruled quickly in our favor. We are getting a clearer picture of what happened, who was involved and who paid for it, and where the money went.
Mr. Meadows received numerous text messages, which he has produced without any privilege claim, imploring that Mr. Trump take the specific action we all knew his duty required.
We do not take this vote lightly, but this committee and this Congress is left with no other alternative when, in the midst of an investigation of this magnitude, we are stonewalled at every turn by those who played a central role in the planning and execution of the January 6th attack.
The committee favorably report to the House the committee's report on a resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Mark Randall Meadows in contempt of Congress.
Okay, back to the United States. Well, we haven't talked about Trump in a while, but things are happening. Just before the show, we started recording the show, we learned that we had been talking about those two prosecutors who quit the New York district attorney's office. When the new district attorney came in, all of a sudden they quit because apparently the prosecution wasn't going to happen. We went to get the story, and let me call it up. One of them is name is I have Mr. Pomerantz here.
Mark Pomerantz.
Mark Pomerantz had been investigating him, and Alvin Bragg is the new attorney, and he halted an effort to get an indictment. It had been before a grand jury, and all of a sudden this new guy comes in. Is this new guy on the take? Or does he just not have the nerve to go after Trump? Or is he just not impressed with the case as the former guy was? We don't know. But prosecutor Mark Pomerantz and another one submitted his resignation. He's a 70-year-old prominent former federal prosecutor who came out of retirement to work on the Trump investigation. And Kerry Dunn is the other one who quit. The New York Times got a copy of the letter, and he basically says that Trump committed felonies, and he lays it out a bit. I don't know why it's taken this long to come out. I don't know if he was bound by a gag order that he's just decided to break. but he's everything from falsifying records to inflating the value of his golf clubs, hotels, and office buildings for to commit fraud, to all kinds of things. And at any rate, and he said no case is perfect or everything like that, but and there were risks, but he says that he was convinced that the failure to prosecute would pose much greater risk in terms of public confidence in the fair administration of justice. And basically, he was partners with somebody who is Trump's lawyer at one time, and they're kind of going at each other in this article, the New York Times article. I suggest people read it. But it is, and Mr. Fichetti's basically saying, no, you didn't have the case. That's why your boss, put the kibosh on it. But at any rate, the drama continues. Dave?
Yeah, you had actually said when we first saw this article that that's what Trump's attorney is supposed to say, because he was a former partner of Mark Pomerantz, and he said, hey, Pomerantz had the opportunity to make his case to Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, and apparently it wasn't persuasive enough. That's where we are. But from the leaked resignation letter, you were talking around the edges of it. I'm just going to read a quick quote because I think it's important. Point blank, he's saying, quote, his financial statements were false, and he has a long history of fabricating information relating to his personal finances and lying about his assets to banks, to the national media, counterparties, and many others, including the American people. The team that has been investigating Mr. Trump harbors no doubt about whether he committed crimes. He did. And that he said Bragg's decision is misguided and completely contrary to the public interest. So the marker's laid down. At some point, Bragg's going to have to respond to these comments publicly or possibly face, some kind of backlash.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is we know that the accountant quit, saying, I don't want anything to do with this. I mean, so, there's a lot of signs there. Now, there is still the civil case going on from the Attorney General of New York State that's related to a lot of this. And they're not giving up, but that's a different standard. You don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It's also not identical, and it pertains to his nonprofit corporation and the rest. It's not all the same stuff, but it did arise out of some of the same investigations, and it'll be very interesting to see. And also, they haven't officially closed the case. They just pulled back from that particular indictment. So I'll be very curious to see what happens with this. Of course, there's a lot of theories about this. Did he lose his nerve? Is he bought off? It's all there. But Trump does seem to have a way of getting out of these things. And he probably just didn't want to be the next person that happened, coming in, fresh after winning an election, didn't want to be his first thing he had to deal with. Who knows? But at any rate, but now he's got to deal with this. Now he's looking like a chicken, right? Whether or not that's the case, that's what it's going to look like to New York City voters, most of whom don't like Trump.
Right. So I know time flies for us, and we get really into this. One of the elements of this segment that you wanted to talk about was, Trump's endorsing of other candidates around the country. And so there's been some recent developments, and I think we're going to talk about one in particular today. Trump pulling his endorsement of Mo Brooks. Yes, and so that's in the state of it's Alabama Senate candidate. So Mo Brooks, I think, recently came out and said that Trump is being manipulated by Mitch McConnell. I don't think that that's actually true, but this is Brooks's way of kind of making excuses for the fact that he's now in distant third place in recent polling with virtually no chance, which is shocking because he had a much larger, I think he had like a 40-point advantage back when Trump first endorsed him. But then he subsequently has said, hey, the GOP, the Republicans need to move on from 2020 and not focus on the 2020 election results. And then the floor fell out underneath him. So last I looked, the most recent polling has Mike Durant at 35%, Katie, oh my goodness, this is so small, Katie Britt at 26%, I'm going to blow those up a little bit. It's really small. Sorry. There you go. Okay. So 28.5%, and then Mo Brooks at 16%. And there's a couple other candidates out there with near zero. There's one candidate whose name is so close to another candidate in the state of Alabama that they've actually pulled 6.5%, and they think that's because most of that support comes from people who don't know that it's really that person. They think it's a different candidate for a different race. But so. Bottom line is, with only 16%, you're talking not much more than 1 in 8 people supporting him. So Mo Brooks is effectively out.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking Alabama, where just because the guy had an R in front of his name, they almost elected somebody who had very strong evidence that he had committed statutory rape. I mean, it was
right.
That was a few years ago. But I want to quote Mo Brooks as to what he said once he lost the endorsement. Mo Brooks said, "President Trump asked me to rescind the 2020 elections, immediately remove Joe Biden from the White House, immediately put Trump back in the White House, and hold a special election for the presidency," Brooks said in a statement. "As a lawyer, I've repeatedly advised President Trump that January 6th was the final election contest verdict, and neither the U.S. Constitution nor the U.S. Code permit what President Trump asks, period." The Civil War continues.
Yeah, that primary is May 24th, so it's right around the corner, a couple of months away here now. Trump's influence is obviously still very, very strong in order to have this type of impact. And I think we're going to talk about another candidate soon too, where Trump's endorsement of a challenger to a incumbent is really potentially going to carry some weight. So Trump, he's still got a solid influence on the base.
Yeah, it is. He definitely does, and of course, not all the Republicans are happy. It's kind of interesting how McConnell fits into this too. It's really strange because Trump has been attacking McConnell. McConnell, he can't touch McConnell. He's trying to get people to oust McConnell, but that's not going to happen. So it's just kind of. But McConnell wishes that Trump was out of his hair. We all know that. Everybody knows that, but he can't do it. And you've got the RNC anyway. It is what it is, and the Republicans would probably be home free and to be able to retake all of Congress, but it's no guarantee because of Trump. Last segment. This is something. Of course, the culture war is bubbling up. We've talked about how critical race theory is at the center of the culture war, but also at the center of the culture war is what has become increasing attacks on transgender people. And where they've decided to focus the front on is in sports. Obviously, the most recent issue is in swimming, where the Leah Thomas has recently won a swimming championship, and whenever a transgender woman wins something, it's seen as unfair. And the interesting thing about it is, statistically speaking, transgender women are actually underperform compared to their level of participation. There's a lot of scientific debate out there. I'm not really up on it as much as, I've tried to read articles, but I just don't. It's above my pay grade in terms of the science. They'll tell you that even though they tend to have muscle mass and bone structure and the rest that might give them advantages in certain situations on average, that the fact that they go through the hormone therapy, that in general they have lower higher estrogen and lower of what's the masculine? Testosterone, thank you, levels by the time they've been through the amount of time that it goes, and that they are actually on 4 cylinders where most women are on 6 cylinders. I mean, they'll say that the science shows this, and that they're actually in many respects at a disadvantage. There's a whole lot of science going back and forth on this, and yet when somebody wins, or somebody loses, the debates come up. I don't know who's right, and maybe it depends on what sport it is, and maybe we need to look at a sport by sport issue and also distinguish between safety versus versus what's fair in terms of competition. But there are also unfair sometimes advantages just between men and cis men and cis men and cis women and cis women. When I played soccer, there were boys in high school that were much bigger, much stronger than I was, and I managed to make the team. Right? It just sometimes happens that way. So what is what it is, but at any rate, it become a big topic because of a particular result. And whenever that happens, it comes out that's unfair. The other 20 times that they don't even place in the finals, it doesn't. But when it happens, it happens. What will bring it up again is if there's an injury or something like that, we'll see. But it comes up, and it comes up in the context of any time there's some type of incident of some sort, in which case you'll see people saying that's a man, not a woman, and it gets hateful, and right now we are seeing it in a lot of different contexts, and even we saw it in the Jackson hearing when Ted Cruz shouted, "Define a woman." And another, I forget what the woman was, the Southern
Marsha Blackburn did it too.
Blackburn, yeah, define a woman, and it's just, it's absolutely petty. It's pandering to the worst aspects. No matter what you believe on it, but this is there is a lot of deliberate ignorance on the subject of it as to who people are, the idea, for an ideology, conservatism that tends to have this belief in individualism that doesn't want to allow individuals to define themselves and who they are is just one of the biggest contradictions ever. Anyway, Dave.
Yeah, this is a really difficult conversation to have because of its multifaceted impacts on people's, I guess, long-standing traditional beliefs, in quotes, whatever that means. But in fact, we are learning as a society and as a community, we're learning more all the time about this, not just in the science like you alluded to, but in just how to talk about it as a community. And I think that, we're seeing people in the context of curriculum conflict, critical race theory conflict, local control, school board control, this topic is being incorporated into that sort of set of things where people on the conservative side have tended to just say we're gonna grandstand at the leadership level, that we're gonna grandstand on this, and we know it's divisive and we know it agitates our base, therefore it's a topic that's ripe for team building and we're gonna agitate on it instead of really trying to understand. Like, for example, you said libertarians and freedom loving folks that make up a large portion of the conservative movement, of the right, of the GOP, the Republicans, you would think that the liberty and the freedom and the self-expression and the individualism would be part of their argument, but instead they're fearful of the impact on children, or at least they play on that. And more scientific and more technical, this hormone replacement therapy, in these articles that we've seen about this swimmer, that it does have massive changes to the body. Muscle mass changes, fat deposits change, like all sorts of performance potential that would come from being born with, traditional higher levels of testosterone, for example. But once you engage in hormone replacement therapy, then things change. And so the evidence here, the outcome is, one of the things I thought interesting about this swimming tournament, this NCAA swimming tournament, was that something like 27 records were broken during this competition alone. And yet, Ms. Thomas was not among them. So winning the class, winning the event that was won, that she won, she didn't set any records, whereas lots of other women athletes did set records. So the sport is always advancing. Our science and our knowledge and our understanding of gender and hormone replacement therapy impact, that's been advancing too. So I think that really, for me, the takeaway is it's an opportunity for us to get a better understanding. It's an opportunity for us to have a community conversation about what these things mean and how they impact people's choices.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the idea though is that they're making this the center point now, and it's probably going to be a big election issue. And the problem here is that there's no way they can do this without making it about hate. I mean, define a woman is just an absolute, and it's one thing for Blackburn to do it because she's kind of out there, but Cruz, you would think he's maybe a little bit more mainstream and should have known better, but I don't know. He's just out of control in this hearing too. So it's really bad. And it's the type of thing that leads to violence. When you set something like this in motion, the ripples get out to the edges, and it's scary. It's going to be scary for a lot of people. Okay, this brings us to the time of our show where we provide our predictions, which may or may not come true. Dave, what have you got?
So I alluded to it a little bit when we were talking about candidates that Trump endorses versus those that he doesn't. And in this instance, I'm going to talk about Liz Cheney, who is running to hold her seat to get reelected for her seat in the Wyoming House. And so as of the last I looked, Harriet Hageman, who's a lawyer and was a 2018 gubernatorial candidate there, she's gotten support from 100 House Republicans for a fundraiser to challenge Cheney, which is about half of the entire House GOP. So it's been a nationalized race for sure. So that includes House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Representative Elise Stefanik of New York, who is now the chair of the House GOP conference. I did look at the local newspaper real quickly, and it said that there was a straw poll earlier in the year, a secret ballot of party activists that gave Hageman 59 votes. Cheney got 6, and one other candidate got 2. One other candidate got 1. So it's just a proxy for the leadership of the Republicans in the state, who had already censored Liz Cheney. And so the fact that this many people, 3 of the people who voted are actually her family members, so she's obviously very high ranked in the state party. But there's almost 200,000 GOP voters. So that the question is, does this straw poll represent the state? And the fact is, it doesn't. Typically, in the past, when the state ran a poll, when the party leadership ran a poll for Congress, Cynthia Loomis, she lost the poll, but then she went on to beat Miller by almost 50 points in the primary less than 2 months later. So there's not a causal effect between party leadership and the electoral outcomes. But my prediction is that, in fact, Liz Cheney is unfortunately really up against it, because it's not just the party leadership this time. It is the Trump base, and she may well, in fact, lose her reelection bid. That's my prediction. She does lose the primary.
Okay, I'll be real quick. Going back to the Jackson hearings, as I noted, I think that this isn't bipartisan anymore. These hearings don't end up being bipartisan, but I do predict that all of the Democrats are going to vote for her, and as well as some Republicans. I believe it's going to be roughly around the same level as the second impeachment. That is 57 or 58. So about 7 or 8 Republicans are going going to vote for her because I do not think that the Republican opposition has been impressive, and that includes Mitch McConnell. I believe it's been irresponsible, and I think that they are actually hurting themselves with the way they've been carrying on with this, and the fact that, and it is not comparable with how Amy Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh were treated, and the situations are not comparable. All right, well, that concludes this week. We will be back next week. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged.
Yes.